I didn't believe the stories at first. They were just tales passed around at the bar, the kind of thing locals told out-of-towners to spook them. The Silent Lake, they called it, a remote stretch of water hidden deep in the woods, surrounded by sheer cliffs and gnarled pines. They said the lake was cursed, though no one could agree on why. Some claimed it was the site of an ancient massacre, the spirits of the dead still lingering beneath its surface. Others whispered about a creature that lived in its depths, waiting for foolish hikers to wander too close. I wasn't afraid of ghost stories. I was afraid of wasting my vacation, sitting in a cabin with nothing to do. The trip had been my wife's idea. A getaway, she'd called it, though I suspected it was more of a forced exile. Things between us hadn't been great lately, and she thought a week in the woods might help us reconnect. But when her job called her back to the city on the second day, I was left alone with nothing but the silence of the forest and my thoughts. That's how I ended up at the lake. The hike there wasn't easy. The trail was overgrown, and the directions I'd found online were vague at best. I had to backtrack several times before I finally stumbled upon it, a narrow path winding down a rocky slope to a clearing by the water. The lake was smaller than I'd expected, but stunningly beautiful. The water was so still it looked like glass, reflecting the cliffs and trees with eerie perfection. There wasn't a single ripple, not even from the wind. I set up my gear, a folding chair, a cooler, and my fishing rod. I wasn't much of a fisherman, but it seemed like the kind of thing you were supposed to do at a place like this. The silence was unnerving at first. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves. Just the occasional drip of water from the cliffside. I told myself it was peaceful, even as the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The first hour passed uneventfully. I cast my line into the water and waited, sipping a beer to pass the time. But something felt off. It wasn't just the silence. It was the way the light seemed to dim, even though the sun was still high in the sky. The shadows around the lake grew longer, stretching across the ground like skeletal fingers. And then there was the smell. Faint at first, like rotting vegetation, but growing stronger with each passing minute. I glanced at the water and noticed something I hadn't before. Small, pale objects scattered along the shoreline. Bones. I told myself they were animal bones, probably fish or small mammals. But the rational part of my mind was already screaming at me to leave. That's when I heard the splash. It wasn't loud, but in the oppressive silence, it sounded deafening. I whipped my head toward the sound, my heart pounding. Something had broken the surface of the water, sending faint ripples toward the shore. I squinted, trying to make out what it was, but the water was too dark, too still. And then I saw it. A figure standing in the shallows, its form distorted by the reflection. It was tall and thin, with long limbs and a head that tilted at an unnatural angle. For a moment, I thought it was a person, maybe another hiker or someone playing a prank. But as I stared, I realized it wasn't moving, not in the way a person would. Its arms hung limply at its sides, and its head lolled slowly from side to side, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move closer, but it didn't disappear either. It just stood there, half submerged, its shadow stretching across the water. I backed away, my hands shaking. My chair tipped over, the clatter breaking the silence like a gunshot. The figure's head snapped toward me. I ran. I didn't bother packing up my things. I just grabbed my phone and bolted up the trail, the sound of my own panicked breathing filling my ears. The path seemed longer on the way back, the trees closing in around me like a cage. I tripped over roots and rocks, my palms scraping against the dirt. When I finally reached my car, I didn't stop to catch my breath. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and started the engine. The drive back to the cabin was a blur, my mind racing with what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the forest. I locked the door and closed the curtains, my hands trembling as I poured myself a drink. It was just a trick of the light, I whispered to myself. Just shadows on the water. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure standing in the lake, its head tilting in that strange, deliberate way. Around midnight, I heard something outside. At first, it was faint, like the sound of branches brushing against the windows. But it grew louder, more insistent, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to move from one side of the cabin to the other. I told myself it was just the wind, and then it stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. I lay there in the dark, my heart pounding, straining to hear anything, that would confirm I wasn't alone. That's when I heard it. A splash. The same sound I'd heard at the lake, but closer this time. Much closer. I didn't go to the window. I didn't want to see what was out there. Instead, I grabbed my phone and dialed my wife. The call went straight to voicemail. "Hey, it's me," I whispered, my voice shaking. Something's wrong. I think someone's outside the cabin. Call me when you get this." I hung up and clutched the phone like a lifeline. The splashing grew louder, more frantic, as if something was thrashing against the side of the cabin. Water began to seep in under the door, dark and murky, carrying the stench of decay. I backed away, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. And then I heard the whisper. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. The whisper came again, faint but unmistakable. "Come back." The voice was soft, almost melodic, but there was something wrong about it. Something hollow. "Come back to the water." I stumbled backward, my foot catching on the edge of the rug. I hit the floor hard, my phone skittering out of my hand. The water was rising now, pooling around my ankles. It shouldn't have been possible. The cabin was on a hill miles from the lake. But here it was cold and foul-smelling, filling the room inch by inch. I crawled toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. The water was up to my knees now, and the whispering had turned into laughter, soft at first, but growing louder, echoing off the walls. And then I saw it. The figure from the lake, standing in the doorway, its head tilted at that unnatural angle. Its eyes were empty sockets, and its mouth hung open in a grotesque grin. "Come back," it said, its voice echoing in my mind. I don't remember much after that. When I woke up, I was lying on the trail near the lake, my clothes soaked and my body aching. My phone was dead, and the sun was just beginning to rise. The cabin was gone. I stumbled back to the road and flagged down a passing car. The driver looked at me like I was crazy when I told him what had happened, but he gave me a ride into town anyway. The locals didn't say much when I told them my story. They just exchanged knowing glances and told me I was lucky to be alive. I left the next day and never went back. But sometimes late at night, I hear it again, the sound of water dripping, the faint echo of laughter, and that soft melodic whisper. "Come back." It wasn't supposed to be a long drive, just a routine late-night shift as a rideshare driver. I've done it for years, picking up tipsy partygoers, exhausted workers, and the occasional oddball. But nothing had prepared me for that night. It started with a ping on my phone around 11:45 p.m. The pickup location was out of the way, a few miles down a stretch of highway with no lights or traffic. I hesitated, but the app showed a generous bonus for the ride. Money's money, right? The GPS guided me to a dirt road flanked by dense woods. The kind of place that makes you think of every horror movie you've ever seen. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but gravel and the occasional branch swaying in the wind. I stopped where the app said the passenger would be. Nobody was there. "Figures," I muttered, checking my phone again. Maybe they'd canceled. Just as I was about to leave, I saw a figure emerge from the woods. It was a woman, dressed in a simple black dress. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her dark hair fell in tangled waves over her shoulders. She moved slowly, deliberately, like she was trying not to disturb the air around her. I rolled down the window as she approached. "Are you, Eliza?" She nodded but didn't say a word. "All right," I said, trying to sound casual. "Hop in." She slid into the back seat, her movements unnervingly smooth. The air in the car grew colder, but I brushed it off. Late October nights were chilly. Nothing unusual about that. "Where to?" I asked, glancing at the destination on the app. It was just an address with no details. "Just drive," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I suppressed a shiver and pulled back onto the road. For the first few minutes, neither of us spoke. I tried to focus on the drive, but something about her presence unsettled me. It wasn't just the silence, it was the way she felt. Like she was watching me. I glanced at the rearview mirror and caught her reflection. She was staring out the window, but her expression was blank, almost lifeless. "You live around here?" I asked, trying to break the tension. "No," she replied, her tone flat. "Visiting someone?" Her lips twitched, almost forming a smile. "You could say that." I gripped the wheel tighter, my palms damp with sweat. Something about her answer didn't sit right. The road stretched on, the trees growing denser with each mile. My GPS recalibrated repeatedly, as if it couldn't decide where we were. I glanced at the app again. The estimated arrival time had vanished. "Eliza," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Are you sure this is the right address?" She leaned forward then, her face just visible in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. "Don't stop driving," she said, her voice suddenly sharp. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Why?" I asked, swallowing hard. Her eyes locked onto mine in the mirror, and for the first time, I noticed something wrong. Her pupils were too large, swallowing up the whites of her eyes. "They'll catch us if you stop," she whispered. "Who?" She didn't answer. The car's clock froze at 12:13 a.m., and the GPS screen flickered. My headlights seemed dimmer, barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. And then I heard it, a sound from outside. It started faint, like distant whispers carried by the wind. But as the minutes passed, it grew louder, closer, a cacophony of voices overlapping, screaming, laughing, pleading. "What the hell is that?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "They know," she said, her voice trembling for the first time. "They know I'm here." I pressed down on the gas, the engine roaring as the car sped down the desolate road. The whispers turned into pounding, like hundreds of fists striking the sides of the car. Shadows flickered in the corners of my vision, darting between the trees, keeping pace with us. "Eliza," I shouted, "what the hell is going on?" "They're hungry," she said simply. "For what?" She leaned back into the shadows of the back seat. "For you." I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a stop, gravel spraying in all directions. The pounding stopped, and the whispers fell silent. "Eliza, get out of the car," I said, my voice shaking. She didn't move. "Eliza, I mean it. Get out." Slowly, she leaned forward again, her face inches from mine. Her eyes were pitch black now, endless voids that seemed to pull me in. "You shouldn't have stopped," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. Before I could respond, the car door opened on its own. The cold air rushed in, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. Figures began to emerge from the woods, their forms twisted and unnatural. They moved jerkily, as if their limbs didn't quite work the way they should. I threw the car into reverse, but the engine sputtered and died. "Eliza," I begged, "what do they want?" She smiled then, a terrible, inhuman smile. "They want to take you," she said. The last thing I remember is the figures reaching the car, their hands clawing at the windows. The glass didn't shatter, it dissolved like smoke. Eliza watched as they dragged me from the driver's seat, her smile never fading. I woke up hours later, alone on the side of the road. The car was gone, along with my phone, my wallet, everything. I tried to explain what happened to the police, but they didn't believe me. No one did. Now every time I drive at night, I check the back seat constantly, terrified I'll see her sitting there again. Because somehow, I know she's not done with me.